Hello. Welcome to everyone out there watching us on YouTube. I'm so glad that you are here joining us at the National Archives online. I wish we could be there in person, but I'm so happy to be able to talk with so many of you right now. I'm Dan Bouk. I'm the author of the book Democracy's Data, The Hidden Stories in the U.S. Census. I'm here with Maud Newton, the author of Ancestor Trouble, A Reckoning and a Reconciliation, which was published earlier this year, I think in March. So I want to allow me a moment here before we begin to explain what brings the two of us together with all of you. Visitors to the National Archives in Washington, D.C. often, at least I always, would go in through the museum entrance on one side of the building. But then many people who are set to research go in around the other side of the building, and to do that they pass by these two, I think of them as sentries, these statues. One that enjoins us to study the past, and other that says, what is past is prologue. As I passed through these sentries many days to work on and research this book, I often thought of these two enjoinders. I'm studying the past, but understanding the past, in this case the past of the nation, as a thing which will help inform and help me think about what the nation's future is, where I fit with my fellow Americans in this story. I also noticed that I was joined in this stream of people past these sentries by many folks who were also researching. They were researching often the pasts of their families, and for them too, I think, the study of the past is a way of understanding themselves and their future as well, their families going into the future. We're all there to study the past. We all believe that the past is prologue. In Ancestor Trouble, this book, Maud Newton explores her own family history to better understand herself, but also is looking to understand how and why so many people try to understand their family histories, why at this particular moment people engage with, seek after, honor, fight with, or reconcile with their ancestors. So I want to read a couple passages from this book to help set the stage, so you have a sense of where Maud is coming from, and I think she'll do a little bit of the same to give a sense of where I'm coming from. So on page 21 of her book, she writes, "A family tree is like a lenticular print. Its most prominent features shift depending on the viewer's perspective. And while many of us who practice genealogy are drawn to the ancestors we admire, whose intelligence or talents or beauty or station we'd like to share, many of us are also in dialogue with those we ardently want not to resemble, whose traits we see in ourselves and wish we didn't, or don't acknowledge in ourselves, but should. Villains may fascinate us, those abandoned to instructions may haunt us, institutions may haunt us, mysteries may consume us. For me, and for a not insignificant number of family history buffs, flawed people are more interesting than those who led decorous lives." So this passage spoke to me as I think it reveals this interest that Maud has and that I have as well, in not just seeing the lives of the past as the pretty ones, but in embracing the messiness of the past, the messiness of folks in the past, and also recognizing a certain amount of intrigue, drama, excitement, fascination in our engagement with historical records. And the other two lines I want to read, one is from page 20, in which Maud writes, "Piecing together a family's lineage from this perspective can be humbling, a way of understanding oneself as a small part of a continually evolving whole." And then on page 30, "The stories we tell ourselves about our ancestors have the power to shape us, in some ways nearly as much as our genetics do." And here I felt, as I read these lines, just a deep kinship immediately with their author, thinking about how important it is not only to study the past, what has happened, but how much these stories we tell about the past, about ourselves and our place in the past, shape who we are as individuals, families, communities, and a nation. So when it seemed possible that I could get Maud to join me here at the National Archives, the site of these records that we so share, and one of the repositories of our nation's history and our family's histories, I didn't think she could possibly say yes, but she did. And so I want to stop my screen share so we can see both of us more fully. I want to thank Maud for being here.
Dan, thank you so much for inviting me to be here. As you know, I also feel that our books are, in such interesting conversation with each other. And I have so much admiration for what you've done here. For those who haven't yet had the pleasure of reading Democracy's Data, Dan focuses on the 1940 census in particular. He does talk about other prior census sets, and this was written, over a number of years before the 1950 census was released. And he really, really delves in there. And I'm just going to give you a little taste of one of the sections that really speaks to me. As I did, Dan talks a little bit about his own family in the early chapters of the book and what he discovered about some of his own ancestors, their income, for example, from the 1940 census, and some other details that were maybe a little less surprising to him. But I wanted to just sort of tie this into what Dan was saying about how our individual stories come together, in this data and, more broadly, all the stories that aren't captured by the data. And so I want to just read something he wrote about what he calls the doorstep encounter, which was when the census taker back in the day would go around to each and every home and have to fit each person or family or collection of people in a structure into the form that was prescribed. The doorstep is the nexus where the best laid plans for an orderly census process encounter a profoundly complicated reality. Focusing on the doorstep and the data produced there, rather than on the data in its tabulated numerical form, quickly disabuses us of any notion that the making of data can be segregated from social dynamics or political forces. At the doorstep, negotiations are had and tweaks are made as reality becomes data on its way toward becoming numbers and facts. These negotiations and tweaks aren't beside the point. They should not be forgotten. They have so much to tell us about our nation, too. They're part of the data. That's why we should bother to read for stories in the data. That's why I wrote this book. When we settled for studying only the official numbers released in the immediate wake of a census, we also settle for the democracy that such a count can sustain. Our democracy is only as good as our data, and our data is only as good as our democracy. Readers will, by the time they have turned the final page of this book, see census data differently and realize that one path to achieving a more equitable and inclusive country involves thinking deliberately and strategically about the census questions we campaign for, the answers we give, the uses of the census we allow, and the values we inscribe in the entire process of manufacturing the nation's data. The census concerns us all. What does it say about us that these are our data, that this is what we seek to know? So I think, most of us who are family history buffs, as I obviously am, having written an entire book on the subject, begin with the individual census data sheets from those doorstep encounters. And, maybe we know assuming we've grown up with our biological parents or we know their identity, we begin perhaps with their parents. Maybe we already know the names of their parents' parents, and we work our way back. In my case, there was one line that I really didn't know that much about, but my grandfather, my mother's father, was said to have married 13 times. His father was said to have killed a man with a hay hook. And so obviously I was very curious about this part of my family. And so through the census, we can learn basic facts about our ancestors. I was able to learn my grandfather's father's name, which I hadn't known. I learned exactly where he lived, which was not quite in Dallas, Texas, which is what I had thought, but a little bit outside of Dallas. And I could verify that he was a farmer. So, these are the kinds of things that we're accustomed to learning from the census, the recent census. And if we're white, and if our ancestors have been here for a while, we may be able to trace it back further in the census. Sometimes really surprisingly intimate details can emerge from this data, and Dan and I will dive into that in a little bit. But as he details in the book, the 1940 census purported to capture income. And so the furor that erupted around that question was not dissimilar to some of the furor that we've seen around COVID masking, for example, concerns about government intrusion. Sometimes we find that our ancestors maybe outright lied to the census taker to make themselves look better or to obfuscate some strange fact about the family. As in the case of people of Mexican descent in the 1940 census, sometimes whole categories of people are essentially erased. So a decision had been made by our, white-centered culture to categorize all people of Mexican descent as white. So in the 1940 census, Mexican as a category is not allowed. And of course, going further back, as many of us are aware, there are documents like the appalling slave schedules, in which people of African descent are identified only by biological sex and age under the name of their enslaver. And so, we can see so much in the census, so much of our individual history and our collective history. And there's so much in this book to think about, including how queer people made their families seen all these years later. And so I wanted to turn it over to Dan to just talk about how he became interested in the census as a subject.
Thank you, Maud. Individual history and collective history. I really like that way of framing and thinking about what just as we look at one of these census sheets, what you can see. And I think together you and I are going to look at some census sheets later and maybe try that out. I did not believe I was going to write a book about the U.S. Census. So I am a historian by profession, and if I had to label the kind of history I do, one way of saying it is that I'm a historian of personal data, that I'm interested in how and why usually states or large institutions or corporations produce categories or ways of thinking about how a person can be made into a data system. The kind of thing that now feels like it's very, very new. Like all of a sudden we've been Facebooked into a new kind of existence, but in fact is the story of modern life. Ever since there have been modern institutions, we have had people being turned into data, and the census indeed is one of those really central institutions for that process. But so I was investigating something entirely different. I was interested in the history of questions about demography. I was writing what I thought might be a book that didn't turn into a book about the idea of the baby boom, how and why folks because they started to imagine and create these models that assumed that America had reached maturity, that from here on in the population was just going to level off, how when they turned out to be wrong, and in fact population just kept growing. But as this first happened, they then said, oh, well, good heavens, then the first group of people that are born, they're an anomaly, they're a bulge, they're a problem, which then this argument carries through for generations as a kind of explanation, or for decades, explanation for why it is that things keep failing. And it's blamed on these people and this false assumption rather than on kind of all kinds of other choices that are made in government. But so I was looking for a woman scientist named Alberti Foudray. I had found her in doing some of this research, and she was this person who I wish showed up more in Democracy's Data. She was by far the best mathematician in the Census Bureau in the 1920s and 1930s. I saw frequently that these really big, important names in people like Alfred Lotka, who's kind of central to a whole variety of different mathematical disciplines, would constantly say, all right, I'm going to show up in D.C. and I'm going to talk to Miss Foudray. And yet I knew very little about her. I'd never read anything about her. And I knew she worked for the Census Bureau. So I went to the National Archives looking for Alberti Foudray. I found some really interesting things about her. Indeed, she was far and away the most talented mathematician in the Census Bureau, but because of her sex, they never gave her a position of authority that was in line with her expertise, and in fact hired a guy to take her to the place as the chief actuary, which was effectively the work she'd been doing for 20 years. So it's a kind of tragic story on that level. As I was looking at, for her, finding this, I was piecing through all of these records for the 1940 census that she was in there for and around. And it was at that moment in the archives, as I kind of looked around me, and I kept seeing all of these... What I kept seeing was people, enumerators, saying, I wasn't paid enough. And as a historian, whenever I see people complaining about things, I think there might be a story. And what that said to me was I had always looked at these census sheets as maybe a way to find out a fact about an individual, but I had never thought about how on the other side of that sheet was also this enumerator, and that it turned out there were 120,000 of these enumerators who had gone out, and that each one of these records was not a fact about a person, but it was a inscription of a conversation. It was a registration of two people interacting in some way, and suddenly the text seemed different. And the other thing that I noticed, or I thought about, was genealogy and family history weren't what I thought they were. So as a historian, most of what I had learned about genealogy and family history was thinking about kind of 19th century genealogical institutions, the purpose of which were largely to enforce ideas about kind of nativist primacy or white supremacy. I think of the Daughters of the American Revolution keeping Marian Anderson from singing at Constitution Hall in the early 20th century. But then as I looked around and I thought about what I'd been hearing from people who were doing family history and genealogical work, was that this was no longer true about who was doing family history. And that really intrigued me, the sense that maybe I could write a book that could be useful in some way to not just tell this national story, but that would kind of try to bring these two things together. So I mean, reading your book, I felt like I learned a great deal. But I wonder if you could maybe tell us a little bit about your sense of what is happening in family history or genealogy these days.
Yeah, definitely. And one thing that I just wanted to flag for those who are listening and viewing us here is, Dan's book. I mean, he does everything that he sets out to do that he just explained. He also really sets the census in an important political and cultural moment. And all of the sort of machinations behind the scenes about how the census was set up, how enumerators were chosen in Mississippi, for example, and that's sort of an interesting segue for me. So, I alluded earlier to this sort of, I think of them as the juicier side of my family, the grandfather who allegedly married 13 times. And I must confess, I have to date found a mere 10 marriages to 9 women. And his father, who had allegedly killed a man with a hayfork, and over many years, I discovered that was true. but he wasn't the sort of swashbuckling, drunk villain I had envisioned. He was actually a very sympathetic character based on what I uncovered. But, sort of on the other side of my family, my father, unfortunately, is a rather extreme white supremacist. So, he grew up in the Mississippi Delta. I know many people grow up in the Mississippi Delta who do not hold his views, but he, because our ancestors had enslaved people in the Mississippi Delta, he felt that slavery should never have been discontinued and that it was inherently correct because our ancestors had done it. And so on the one side of my family, I had this sort of Texan background, these larger than life ancestors. And then on the other side, I had this legacy that I think, unlike a lot of people whose families, participated in chattel slavery by enslaving Black people, I didn't have the ability to pretend that didn't happen or sort of look away from it because it was very primary in my home. This sort of my father's racism as a guiding principle and his explicit white supremacy. And so that was another part of what drew me to this data, wanting to understand what did my ancestors do exactly? How involved were they in this system? To some degree, I hoped that I would find that, their involvement was minimal. And that's not what I found. To this day, I still have not uncovered all of my ancestors who enslaved Black human beings in this country. And so, the census has been really the primary tool that I have used to uncover these histories. And I think, so I think there, on the one hand, there are people who are just sort of looking for that sort of connection to their ancestors. They're, this sort of desire that I really empathize with to feel a sense of connection, to claim something, about these human beings whose bodies created ours, right? But on the other hand, the census records how our ancestors were in relation to what was happening in the larger picture. Whether our ancestors enslaved other human beings, if our ancestors, I, to my surprise, discovered I was descended from an accused witch in Northampton, Massachusetts. But then I also discovered that her husband, my ninth great-grandfather, was instrumental in killing and displacing the indigenous people of that region. And so, his mere presence there, even leaving aside the deep holes I've been able to unearth, suggests that kind of relationship. And so, I think that there's a spectrum, of people who are drawn to genealogy, and sometimes it is very, very personal and limited to that. And for me, that's how it began. But the more I learned, the more curious I became about the country as a whole and the larger world and other human beings who existed at that time. And so I think a lot of times there's a conversation about genealogy being narcissistic, and I see that argument. But on the other hand, I think it's actually kind of a doorway or a doorstep moment to, to something that, it has a lot more meaning and creates a potential within the searcher and in the culture at large for thinking about how we want things to be going forward. And I think now we really wanted to nerd out a little bit, and I think you have some census sheets to start digging into.
I do. Here, I'll share my screen again, and while I'm doing that, I will, uh, let's see, I will note that, speaking of that as a doorstep moment, I think is really appropriate to think about our own, these census sheets place us at this doorstep alongside these individuals. And one of the things that is, I have to sometimes catch myself because I think it's easy to romanticize that doorstep moment and to imagine. I often kind of think about this. I think of the census as this amazingly important democratic institution. It exists to ensure that there is a fair distribution of power amongst the states, that each individual theoretically will be recognized. From the very beginning, we know that was an ideal that was more posited than actually operated fully. So we know that when the census was first put in place, it was put in place alongside language in the Constitution that did not count any American Indians, Native Americans, that counted as 3/5 of a person, all enslaved people, as part of a complicated bargain between southern and northern states. And so the basic principle, this ideal that each person will count on the census, and then by being counted, we can fairly distribute power, was there from the beginning, but is often operated in the breach as kind of a struggle we continue to go after as a society, as a nation. But so when I think about these encounters, these doorstep moments, kind of to the point of Maud talking about thinking back and encountering our ancestors in the past, sometimes these could have been really nice moments. Indeed, we have all of these stories that Census Bureau is very happy to share, and this is why I know about them, in which enumerators are asked in for tea or given dinner, or in fact have so many different invitations to dinner that they have to choose amongst them. And so I like that the idea of this doorstep encounter as a friendly, neighborly moment. But to Maud's point, also, there's a lot of suspicion. So when folks, for instance, well, we might talk about income in here as we look at some of these sheets, but one of the reasons the 1940 census income question was so controversial was surprising to me. I thought that what I was going to find was that people were concerned primarily about Big Brother. This is before Big Brother, hadn't been invented yet, but that it's about central oversight by the federal government looking at and understanding this information. And yet then what I found was people who would write to, in this case, a senator who was leading the charge against the income question. And there's one letter that I admit I find it a little bit kind of hilarious, but which maybe is not appropriate, but in which a widow writes to the senator and says, "I make something like $262 a month." She says exactly what it is. I just can't remember. "And I don't want the government to know." And she writes this to her senator. And I just, my head kind of explodes at that moment, because of course she's writing it to her senator. The government knows, but what becomes clear from her letters and from many other letters that came out at the same time is that it was less that they were concerned about the central government or the federal government knowing this. They didn't want their neighbors to know. And the enumerator coming to their door was likely to be a neighbor, and sometimes somebody from a different kind of political position, and there was a great deal of distrust. So we have this, I think often folks have this vision of like the past as being a place where people trusted one another and lived in small communities, and small communities were just as full of concern and distress and interpersonal tension as they are today. And so it was really interesting to see the way in which that kind of privacy concern manifested as a concern about other folks there. So whenever we encounter these doorsteps, whether it's doorsteps back to our ancestors, doorsteps to a new data system, or doorsteps to seeing these enumerators talking to individuals, I think of them as moments in which there might be happiness. There could be creativity as people work together, but there could, and it probably often was, conflict, tension, maybe even outright hostility between the folks who are kind of putting this together. So yes, I'm going to start us with this sheet, which this was, Maud and I talked about it ahead of time. We thought that this might be a good place to start. Maud, do you want to lay out what's interesting here?
Yeah, I mean, I'll let you dig into the specifics, but one thing that I was particularly fascinated in this book, and again, there it is, is that Dan, uncovered this really interesting use of the designation partner. So instead of identifying someone as a spouse, identifying, someone as a child or a boarder or, something along those lines, some people were designated as partners. And, he'll get into this a bit more, but, it was in some ways a catch-all term for certain kinds of living arrangements. And it varied to some extent by geography, to Dan's point about how I've gotten a note that my audio is shaky, so I'm going to try to fix that a little bit here. So to Dan's point about geography, the ways that the term was used really varied depending on region, but it was used in the way that we've become more accustomed to it being used these days to designate queer couples. And I found it, Dan talking about his own family toward the end of the book was really poignant. But I was hoping that you could sort of describe the use of partner. Here it looks like you have one of the West Village or thereabouts sheets pulled up here.
Yeah, that's right. So thank you for that setup. This is Greenwich Village. The enumerator is, I think, I should know this, but I think it says Lillian Rita Davis, who is walking through this neighborhood. And as you look through these census records, and this is, I think, is a neat example too of thinking about how we tell the stories about our past. So as these enumerators wander through these communities, they were required to not only enumerate individuals, but every census is really, and this is going to be clear to a lot of folks who've worked with these records, a household census. A person only counts if they can be fit into a household. They have to be put in relationship then to, now it's person one, but at that point there would be a head of household, and it is the rules make it explicit that it's a patriarchal system, so the assumed head will be a male, and so then the assumed spouse is going to be a wife. And so you see that in this column labeled number 8, a little ways in there, it says sister, head, wife, head. So these are individuals living alone. Head, brother, head, wife, son, head, wife, head, wife, head, partner. Head, daughter. So it was that partner one that caught me, and a friend pointed this out to me and asked me to what this partner meant. And of course with Maud I thought, nowadays if we say partner, I might say I have a partner in crime, but most of the time a partner might mean in someone I'm intimate with, someone I live with, someone I might be in a romantic relationship with. And it's often, especially, has come to be so widely used because of a way in which queer households can find a way to identify themselves or make themselves legible. So I thought, well, maybe then, I'd never run into a partner. What if I start with communities that I know had large gay populations or queer communities and see if they see more partners there? And so we know from looking at kind of the population at large in 1940, that collecting all of these inscriptions, this wasn't done by the Census Bureau, but it's been done by researchers since then, that partners as a whole show up as far less than 1% of the entire population. So you'd expect if partners were evenly distributed, they'd only show up every once in a while. It turns out, though, in just, for instance, this one Greenwich Village neighborhood, there were, I think, 12 partners. There were a ton of partnerships, a significantly higher percentage, and then throughout in New York, in San Francisco, but in some other places too, along the border with Mexico, in Hawaii, there's significantly higher proportions of people who are labeled partner. And so I don't know ultimately what we're looking at here. So in these sheets, this first sheet, the first partner I just talked about, we see James Wynne and Richard Smith. James Wynne, we can find out over here, they're both identified as white men in their, looks like, middle 30s. And they both work for the police department. So in this case, this is a detective and a patrolman living together, and they're using partner as a way of understanding their relationship. We don't know if this means that they're in a romantic relationship. This could be essentially a way in which they're understanding roommates. And one of the things that I think is so interesting about thinking about this as a conversation is also we don't know whether their partner was a category that they would have held as important to them, or one that Lillian Rita Davis, walking through a queer community, came to understand was useful to her as she tried to figure out, what do I do with all of these households that aren't man and wife, which is what the sheet seems to imply or want things to be. And then if we look down a little bit further, we find a couple of two people identified as women, as a white female in their 40s, Lee Lustgarten at the very bottom, who's the secretary, and the industry is liquor. And then on the next page, see if I can get it to go to the next page, is her partner, Tessie Finger, who is implausibly a municipal stenographer, which just feels like the perfect name. And again, Lee Lustgarten and Tessie Finger is ultimately a kind of mystery. And I thought this would be a little bit interesting to talk with Maud about how it is we encounter these mysteries. But we see certainly a sense that in these queer communities, the partner becomes this important means by which people can be at least temporarily enumerated. The kind of final thing to say about this is just that while it's true that this was a useful tool for counting people, when it came time to actually produce the facts about America, then all of these partners are erased. So they're all lumped in together under a larger umbrella term of the lodger. And they become, so up until 2012, when these records were all revealed, there were no partners in the story of America. And it's only now, in writing this book, for instance, that I'm able to start to tell the story of what a partnership meant, or what it meant to be a partner in the census back in 1940. So, Maud, I don't know if you want to respond to any of that, or think with any of these stories with me, or just think about how it is we deal with the kinds of mysteries that these sheets reveal to us.
Yeah, I mean, it's really fascinating, and I kind of want to superimpose the story that I like on Lustgarten and Tessie Finger and the others in the neighborhood. Yeah, you're so right that we can't really know. But one thing that I sort of really carry forward here in looking at these is your observations toward the end about how queer people now sort of strategize to use the terminology of the census in a way that makes it possible for the reality of their relationships and their lives to be seen in the future. And so I do wonder if there was a little bit of a subversive thing going on. Both the enumerator and the people in some of these houses wanted to say, okay, in 1940, we're here, we're queer, and it's, but you also write about the ways in which partner could be a designation, in homes or buildings where large numbers of workers were grouped together, and other sorts of situations where maybe no other designation seems right to be ultimately we are left unless we're able to research these individuals.
Yeah.
And that ties into, I know one of the things we talked about is the census sheet with my great-grandmother Rindy on it. And so Rindia was the mother of my grandfather, who was allegedly buried. Rindia was is my great-grandmother, and she was the mother of my grandfather, who was allegedly married 13 times. And on this sheet, she appears to possibly reveal that she had had a miscarriage. So this is the 1910 census, and here in this census, they ask the question, how many children are living of yours? And there's one, my grandfather. And then they also ask how many children he had given birth to. And the answer was 2. And I really had to sit with that for a while. What an incredibly intimate faith for me, her great-granddaughter to discover about her all these years later. And I think you really highlight, the income example with your own grandparent in the book was really poignant. When you discovered that they, in the 1940 census, like so many people, weren't really making enough to get by. And so, yeah, I think another of the sheets I sent you underscores, some of the white lies that people might tell. Oh, yes, and so here we just saw the larger sheet here where we can see the number of children born to Rendia and then the number of children living. So next to her name, we can see those.
Sorry.
Yeah, and then in the next sheet, my self-given namesake, my given name is Rebecca, but my self-given namesake is Maud. And so somewhat illegibly here, we can see my great aunt Maud, who is living with her mother in the 1920 census. And so at this point, I happen to know that Maud was divorced from her husband. She had gotten married in Illinois, and the marriage had not worked out, and so she had moved back to the Mississippi Delta. And so the story for the 1920 census taker was that great-great-aunt Maud was widowed. So that's one of many examples that I came across where either Maud herself or perhaps her mother, someone else in the household, was trying to put a better spin from the standpoint of prevailing custom on the fact. And then we can see in the next census, 1930, Maud is listed as divorced. So, it's interesting to see how people, try to fit themselves within these facts and the ways that they try to make themselves more palatable in the census paper. And, one of the things that you get into in the book is the many ways that people try to evade the income question. I wonder if you wanted to talk about that a little bit. But also, there's this issue in Mississippi, as we've discussed, of race, of white supremacy, and you really dive into that in the book. And so, I know sort of for time, we really wanted to talk about how race is constructed through the lens of Uwao Moriyama, the census employee. And, this was, of course, in 1940. And, shortly after this census was taken, the census would break its own rules. And I'll let you take it.
Thank you. Before I jump into the Moriyama story, I do want to just note that there's a connection, I think, between the stories you were just telling about from those census sheets in 1910, 1920, 1930. At one level, those stories, I think, help us to remember that when people are at this doorstep encounter, they are trying to both use the census categories that are available to them, but they're to do it to tell a story that's going to be acceptable to the person they're talking with, and that's going to work in their community. And it might even be that what we're seeing here are something like social facts, right? It might not be that being a widow was something that was only shared with the census enumerator, but rather evidence that Rindia was a widowed woman for some period of time as a social way of understanding who she was. And this is how I often think about what the census does, is it shows us what a person was in their community. And indeed, especially this is very much true for race, in which enumerators were given very important instructions. And often, at this point, we now in 2020 it's understood that race is a category that one self-enumerates. One explains what one's race is, and that is the fact that their Census Bureau records. Enumerators in the 1940 census often were asked to ascribe race, to make their own judgment, or if they couldn't, if they were unsure of the race of the person that they were encountering, the enumerator instructions were very clear that they didn't go and take a blood test or try to figure this out as a kind of biological or even a historical inquiry. It was a social inquiry. Race, when we say today race is socially constructed, this is not necessarily a newfangled idea so much as it is an actual fact about what happened with race for many, many years. So the Census Bureau said, talk to people's neighbors. Ask them, what race is this person? What race do they live as? And that will be the proper answer for understanding how a person's race will be interpreted according to within these existing categories. I think the other thing that these stories about Rindia and Maud Newton. Oh, sorry, it was Maud. Sorry, it was Maud Newton who was living as a widowed woman. But the story of encountering Rindia's story and thinking, oh, this is a very intimate thing. It's precisely because in the 20th century, the Census Bureau started to ask very intimate questions about women's fertility and biological lives. The 1940 census does also have those questions, but they're asked only of a sample of individuals. So at the very bottom of this sheet, you can see questions that are only asked to a couple people in this whole sheet of individuals, and that includes some questions about fertility. But those questions, like the income question, were very contentious. And that is why the Census Bureau in the 20th century started to create these rules saying your answers will be held confidential. They won't be shared with other government agencies after they're collected. They won't be used for taxation purposes, which income, clearly people are concerned about their income being used for taxation purposes, that these numbers won't be used for any kind of charge against you to send you off to war. And the idea was that this will encourage people to, as the 1940 Census Bureau slogan was, cooperate in the 1940 census. War, though, tended to kind of press against that claim to confidentiality. It happened during World War I, and then it happens in World War II. And you can see it in a number of different fashions, but the story of Iwao Moriyama, I think, is really telling here. His parents lived in San Francisco when the Roosevelt administration, without really any particular evidence, decides the Japanese Americans are a danger after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and decides that all Japanese Americans will be removed from the West Coast. Either if they cannot move voluntarily, they will then be placed in concentration camps. Moriyama's family is able to escape first before that happens. They're allowed to leave. They come to Washington, D.C., where they live with Moriyama in his home. Moriyama, it turns out, my colleagues, the historian Margot Anderson and William Seltzer, discovered, is interesting and is important here because he was released at a moment when the Census Bureau, the Census Bureau helped provide tabular data, not individual data, but data about individuals, very fine-grained tables of where Japanese Americans lived on the West Coast to facilitate that removal, and the Census Bureau has since apologized for that action. But then after 1942, the laws changed, making confidentiality, suspending confidentiality requirements temporarily until 1947. And during that period, Census Bureau did produce some individual records, the things they promised they would never do. And included on one of those lists was a list of everyone of Japanese descent living in Washington, D.C. in 1943. And there was a figure named 65 and a half. And it turned out it was Iwao Moriyama. Moriyama was listed as being a Census Bureau employee, and my colleagues wondered, why is it that Moriyama is here at 65 and a half? He's at the very end of a list. Clearly he was a late addition, and they were thinking about this before the census came out, so they speculated, well, maybe this is about saving a colleague, that the Census Bureau was trying to keep him out, but then finally were forced to put him in there by somebody higher up who realized that he was missing. Then when the 1940 census came out, we were able to do some more research, and here you can see his sheet. And let's see if I've blown it up here. Moriyama here is listed in this lodging house, a series of lodgers in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C., it's important to remember, is a segregated place in which African Americans live in very different neighborhoods and are not supposed to be mixing with white individuals. And what we see is the reason that Iwao Moriyama did not show up on that first list is because they looked for people of Japanese race, and he was coded here as being white. Which, again, we could look at as an enumerator error, but actually I think it speaks in many really important ways to the way in which race is constructed, that one of the reasons Moriyama first doesn't show up as a Japanese American is because he's understood as white because he lives in a white boarding house. He played on the Census Bureau was segregated at this time. He played on the white softball team. He played in the white bowling league. So in a way, white was probably the more accurate category to understand in the Jim Crow Washington, D.C., his kind of social place. So the Moriyama story, it both is part of this cautionary tale, understanding that if the people who are in charge of the data don't protect confidentiality, the kind of terrible ways it can be weaponized against individuals, and the story also helps us to understand how it was that race was constructed through these records.
And, there's a question that really ties into this. Was information from neighbors taken as valid data? So when a neighbor told the enumerator, in your hypothetical that Maud was widowed, or, maybe the head of the boarding house told the enumerator that Moriyama was white, was that taken, as fact? And, can you also, a second question, can you talk a little bit about the delay in release of census?
Yeah, I'll be happy to talk about both those things. The first one is not only was information from neighbors valid data, but it was often considered to be important data. I think in some situations it was understood as a kind of way of ensuring that people were telling the truth, that you could, if an enumerator was unsure of a racial categorization, for instance, they could ask the neighbors, is this the right thing for this? And so neighbors often did provide important, valid information. That being said, one of the reasons people, as they kind of wander through census sheets, will notice that they don't always go in perfect geographical order, right? The Census Bureau person wanders around and knocks door to door, but often at the very end of the sheets, they'll find a whole bunch of people that should have been earlier. Because if people aren't home, they don't answer the door, the Census Bureau, then the enumerator comes back and tries to find them. And so as a result, there's still a basic idea that the individual's household should answer. But even if you look at this, the screen that I've shared, a number of these names have a little star, a little mark next to them. That indicates that those individuals were interviewed directly. So in this case, for instance, we see Moriyama was interviewed directly by the census enumerator, who then judged him to be a white man working as a vital statistician in the Census Bureau, Census Department. But not everyone is labeled there, in which case their information as lodgers was probably given by either a neighbor or more likely by the owner of that lodging house. Now, these census records become available only after 72 years. So that's why the 1950 records, as Maud noted a little earlier, just became available to the enormous excitement of nerds like us, as we're interested to get into these and start to figure out the stories they tell us about our families, about our communities, and about the nation at large. And that 72-year, why it's 72 years is an interesting story, which I won't get into here, but you can get a little piece of it if you pick up the book. And it's an interesting kind of negotiation, again, about this drive to have confidentiality, and then this understanding that these records, after a certain period of time, do become really useful to medical researchers, to social scientists, and really powerfully, that they become important researchers to people studying their families.
So we have one more question. We're going to run out of time because we will be stopping it. So I wanted to thank you again, Dan, for inviting me to do this with you, and I wanted to thank the National Archives for allowing me to do it as well. And I know, again, the book, Democracy's Data, you get into this so much more in the book, and you spoke about it a bit earlier, but I think people are still wondering exactly how and to what extent the census was used to identify Japanese people who were sent to the camps in World War II.
Mm-hmm. Right. So one of the ways to understand this is that the Bureau had just completed the census. It was trying to produce then the counts of state populations and other statistics that it needed to prepare. The war comes, and Bureau officials are very, they're concerned that they don't either look patriotic enough if they don't support this effort, or that they're not going to have any funding and be able to hold on to their people to continue this statistical operation. And so they make choices that I really think they should not have made, to be very directly involved in the process. So they produce lots of different tabulations of, at local levels, numbers of Japanese, but also Germans and Italian Americans as well. But then amongst Japanese, then produce very fine-grained data showing in particular neighborhoods where it is the Japanese Americans can be found. So not individual information, but very fine-grained aggregate data. And that they loan officials from the Census Bureau to go and help use their expertise in tabulation and in statistical work to make that work more efficient. And so they're deeply involved in this process. This is why the Census Bureau apologized in 2000. And whenever I talk about this, my folks that I work with, who are both interested in this whole history, but also interested in making sure that populations continue to be counted today, always say, and they're right to stress, since 2000, since 1947, this law confidentiality was reinstated at a very strong level, and over the succeeding years, the protection of confidentiality has been a really important thing that Census Bureau is concerned about. They produced new mechanisms to even try to ensure that this aggregate data at small levels about vulnerable populations won't be released, because I believe the census is really important. It's a place where everyone should count. And these stories, I think, are important to understand because the data can be weaponized, but it's also good to know that people can and should let themselves be counted by the government. It's the way in which they get to have a say in our society.
Thank you so much, Dan. And thank you, everyone, for being here. Thanks again to the National Archives. And I'll leave you with the last word.
This has been such a pleasure and really such an honor that you joined me here. An honor to be at the National Archives, this place that has provided me with these records, but provides all of us, protects these records from fire, from age, and makes it possible that we continue to tell all these stories. So I want to thank you, Maud. I want to thank National Archives, and I thank you all for spending this time with us.